Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Kelly Mullan. So Kelly is independent scholar, ex-dancer, and a loving mother, so she describes herself. So I became aware of Kelly through a thesis she wrote, which is all about the history, theory, and scientific foundations of Somatics. So that's what we're going to spend quite a lot of time talking about. I think today's going to be a bit of a history lesson for people. But before that, I'd love to get a bit of, Kelly, I don't know that well, actually. I'd love to get a bit of her personal story. So Kelly, how did you get interested in the body?
Well, I guess I'd always been a professional, a dancer for years. And I think it related to Cymatics. I got interested in, as a dancer, we would have sometimes special experiential learning classes, like improvisation work and creative imagination guided visualizations to provide us with an alternative way to access our body, access feelings in the body, but also access ideas about how the body could move in different ways other than our dance technique. I was at a professional modern dance school in Montreal, Les Ateliers de Danse Moderne, which is now known as has a different name, Contemporary Dance School. But a lot of the teachers had come from, one came from Juilliard. She had studied ideokinesis with, and which is a way of teaching dancers how to think about alignment and posture in your body by using creative ideas, essentially. Like if you're standing tall, you pretend you have a string coming out of the top of your head, and you're floating. It's attached to a balloon, and it's floating in the air. And by using that imagery, it would give you a different way of feeling or sensing your body in space, or just thinking about posture instead of just like being a mechanical manner of like, move your shoulders back, put your head up right, Have you heard of ideokinesis?
Yeah, I've tried it. I love it. I find some of the visualizations or kind of active visualizations very helpful. And we had other dancers on the show, and it seems that, some modern dance is very disembodied, quite brutal, kind of sort of ballet backgrounds and things. And then others is really other schools. I'm hearing some in London, I know, like one of my friends works at the place, really incorporate a lot of somatic practice, like Feldenkrais lessons almost every day, and Alexander technique, or some of the ideokinesis, different things. It seems like it's caught on in the dance world.
Yeah, I think it always has been part of the dance world in a strange way, because even from all my history research, it's a way for the body and the mind to connect in a different way than just through straight up the dance movement. And also it's always been connected to the dance world. And when there's been injuries, like people have injured your legs, then you want to stay in shape, maybe you do Pilates or something like that. So you can still be working with the body and keeping in tune.
And there's also a tension, isn't there, with dancers between the sort of performance body, they're people who are paid to be seen, to move on a stage, and then embodiment, Cymatics, being around this internal sense. So there's a kind of a tension there, I think.
Yeah, I think Cymatics or embodiment work through in the dance world also, especially in my dance school, it was also to teach you how to essentially get to your inner self, so that you would be a completely somehow an independent dancer and being, that your own personal spirit is somehow able to shine out through your dancing, and it essentially makes you a better and more interesting dancer to watch also. Yeah. It's in Montreal, it's a very alternative kind of approach to dance, or modern dance is very eclectic in Montreal, and all the choreography also. So anyway, also through injuries I got as a dancer, I found different somatic practitioners, but also then when I was teaching dance in Boston after I retired as a dancer, and actually I was a physical theater artist also. I did circus and acrobatic work, so I had a lot of injuries too, and would go to somatic practitioners, or like craniosacral therapy or scar tissue massage. So I'd always been familiar with it. But when I was teaching in Boston, I was teaching high school kids, and actually was thinking about I wanted to teach more advanced dancers and go and get my master's and go to work in a university or something like that and teach Cymatics to dancers. Because I didn't necessarily want to be a dance teacher anymore. There was just teaching the dance moves or choreography. I wanted to teach embodiment for dancers. So I started to do a training program in New York City with Dr. Martha Eddy in dynamic embodiment, her technique. And while I was training in her method, I was actually trying to figure out while I was learning these practices, like, well what is somatics? Because it's not like in her, and when you do somatic training, a lot of it is actually just experiential learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So there's not much written on it, isn't there? There isn't much sort of defining. And maybe we could say something about the word somatics. So obviously Thomas Hanna, specifically called his work somatics, but then it's more broad. Some people use it interchangeably with embodiment. How would you define the term somatics and maybe as compared to embodiment?
Well, I think somatics, like traditionally, even from the Greek entomology, or what Hannah was even speaking to, and Don Hamlin Johnson, which I know you've interviewed him, seeing as they were two theorists who were also trained in philosophers. So they drew on somatics from the Greek root. Basically, it's in the living body. It's like, it's not your soul, it's not necessarily the spirit, but it's your essence, your sense of your inner body. And when you're dead, you no longer have a soma, but when you're dead, you could have a soul, maybe. But embodiment, I think, is a little bit different, is that it's a way of trying to find the soma. If you know what I mean? It's like trying to get access to becoming embodied. I guess it's kind of interchangeable, but I think the biggest difference is that somatics is actually a name for a field of work, of technical practices.
Yeah. I tend to avoid somatics, even though I like the sort of Greek root and that word that incorporates body, but also psyche, psychological and social and political. That's all in the Greek, as I understand it, as opposed to sarx. But I tend to avoid it because A, people haven't heard of it, so it weirds them out. But B, there's a very specific body of work that has that name.
Yeah, for all the practices like body-mind centering or Feldenkrais or Hanna somatics. And I think it's important to keep the word a bit because it covers a whole field of work that has like 200-year-old educational lineage. So embodiment is a great word and people relate to it a lot easier, I think.
But most of those schools don't call themselves somatic schools, do they? Like, I mean, I was referring simply to Thomas Hanna's school of somatics, like the small use of the word rather than the wider use that you're making there. Does that make sense? There is a specific field called somatics, which is Thomas Hanna's body of work, which is taught by various people.
Yes.
And then
but somatics is also, it's not only related to his technique, it's also a field of work that is related to techniques that grew out of a certain variety of teachers that are kind of connected historically.
Yeah. So there's a sort of narrower definition and a wider definition.
Yes.
Just starting out to make sure we're sort of roughly on the same page with terms here, because I also know you're an academic and it would be a good person to ask about some of the specific things here. So when I was looking at the sort of history of embodiment, somatics, this whole area, someone sent me your paper and I immediately shared it with all my students. Oh,
awesome.
Yeah, I put it on the group that we have for the Embodied Facilitator course graduates and said, guys, everyone have a look at this, because there's not that much written on this field, which is like, I guess was why you wrote it, right? Like you kind of went, well, hang on a minute, there's not actually that much written on this.
Yeah, and I kind of drove myself crazy looking for different books. Or I read Don Hamlin Johnson's book, Bone, Breath, and Gesture, but there's all these interviews and it's separate interviews, so it's not like he's just did his analysis himself of the historical field based on those interviews and then gave a description of the. I mean, he's done a lot of essays. I built a lot of my work off of his. Yeah, but I wanted something simple enough. See, I wanted to condense a whole bunch of information. Also, for other people to, what is somatics? So it's a brief read. I think it gives like a very rough, but broad analysis in a condensed way for other students to be like, oh, okay, I get it.
And if you don't mind, I'll share it with this podcast so people can have a good look at it as well.
Awesome.
So I guess, it's an incredibly bold thing that it says is this science, the theory, history, and scientific foundations. I think today let's focus on the history side of it, if you're right with that, because I feel like you've got a good overview of that.
Yeah, so as I've been after my thesis, I keep on getting like deeper and deeper into the history. I have a number of publications after my thesis because I kind of was honing into different practitioners, basically because in the beginning of Bone, Breath, and Gesture, Don Hamlin's book, he said all these people in these interviews are related to this ancestor, Leo Koffler, who was a breath teacher. Because essentially a lot of these somatic teachers have incorporated different uses of the breath.
Uh-huh.
But as I continued my research, I just found that was actually historically inaccurate, which is, I can drive myself crazy just like looking for answers and things like, well, who is that person? I'm going to find out more. And then, so he did inspire certain other teachers. He was a teacher from New York City. And there's a whole thing called vocal culture at a certain time when a lot of people were practicing oratory, public speaking, and just time before TV and everything like that. So it'd be a lot of people giving lectures in the lecture stage or the lecture circuit or singing and doing monologues in front of in church halls or theaters to entertain people. So there's a method of practice. Vocal culture is basically teaching people how to use intonation of the voice, breath, and rhythm, and using your lungs in different ways. Almost thinking about yoga breathing, all the yoga breathing practices is actually also part of the oratorical practices. So a lot of the early somatic practitioners, all of them had a lot of different breathing methods and exercises, and they would talk about having learned them. So Johnson sort of made the assumption, based off of a couple teachers mentioning Leo Koffler's name, that he had trained certain teachers, and all those teachers were carrying on his methods.
How do you spell that in case people want to Google it? Leo?
Kofler.
Okay. Put them on the show.
Because essentially one of the earliest recognized by historians or academic people in the somatic field, one of the earliest somatic practitioners is Elsa Gindler. Have you come across her name? She was a German teacher.
Yeah, it's like some people think this whole field began in the sort of 60s in Islam, but there was a whole Central European tradition prior to that. I mean, obviously Alexander, goes back a way, but there was a whole bunch of people coming out of dance movement therapy and also the body therapy traditions of Reich, right, in Central Europe.
Mm-hmm. And he was kind of thought to be related to Gindler. There's also all these mistaken things saying Reich trained Gindler, but actually Gindler trained Reich's wife. And he kind of incorporated or learned some things. So she had basically a whole way she had originally been trained doing like dance and certain technical practices, and then wanted to get more and more sort of esoteric in her approach. But basically that was because the Nazis were coming in and saying, you can't teach any codified, if you're a school in any way that teaches anything that's codified, you also have to teach Nazi propaganda. So she said, okay, well, I don't teach anything. I have people experience things. And she took the essence of
the vagueness of the Californian tradition. That sort of started a tradition of being sort of deliberately vague that continues. And I kind of, it's only like this paper of yours should have been written 30 years ago. Like why is it only just now people like me and you are trying to get clear about this stuff?
So some of her teachers went to California, basically. So that's how the California leap went. She trained Charlotte Shelver, who gave the first experiential classes at Esalen. And then all these people were like, whoa, what's this? And so it's basically, she taught, but even people say you don't teach this sensory awareness. Basically, you guide people into experiencing your senses in a greater way. Maybe just even by walking around the rocks and feeling the cold, and then feeling the texture on your feet. And so she gave all these.
This is Shelver or Gindler? Who are we talking about now?
Shelver. She was a student of Gindler who went to California.
And it was kind of like mindfulness, right? Like there was a lot of sort of, and this is quite big in France still, I've been told.
There in France, it's a different branch of Gindler's teachers. It's harmonic gymnastics, which is more the technical movement exercises and experiences using tools or things like lay across, like say a yoga brick or something like that. Or lay your back on a rod and like just feel your spine. And there's all these subtle, more body awareness exercises. Whereas Shelver, when she came to California, went full on just experience the senses, the sensory, your environment, and is almost like nothing dogmatic about it. It's more like a Zen kind of experience. And actually she attracted all these like Zen students who are very like Alan Watts, who are very interested in just this new way of experiencing your environment.
Yeah, kind of raw experience.
Yeah.
And if we take it back a little bit further then, so I mean, there's the Eastern traditions, right, which go back often not as far as people think, like Tai Chi and yoga aren't as old as people think, but they go back a way. And then in the West, there's a few different traditions there. So is it Francois Delsarte is often named? I believe he's in your paper too.
Yes.
Am I saying that right? Quebecois will be rolling over in their grave at my pronunciation, no doubt.
No, that's right. Yeah, Francois Delsarte. I've been focusing a lot on branching off of my thesis and going more into the history. Delsarte is. I'm going to go back. I'm going to actually back up a sec.
Okay.
So you're saying, like the Eastern. I mean, everybody. It's typically thought like yoga and everything's 5,000 years old, and of course, right now we're in a time where actually it's being all completely reanalyzed. That yoga is actually not that
and
old.
Tai Chi just a few.
Yoga is maybe. The philosophy is old, but yoga asana and all the practices
postural yoga
is not at that old actual postures that we are doing. Yes, it's like a couple hundred years old. And a lot of that is actually related to Western physical culture.
Yeah, Swedish gymnastics, British military fitness, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that went there and they trained and all these or different the YMCA programs from the States that went and founded institutions all over India. And they were teaching Swedish gymnastics also, because they came to the States and it was this whole mass movement.
So they're culturally appropriating us.
A little bit. But they mixed it. It was all mixed in. But Swedish Ling gymnastics doesn't have all the twists and stretches that are all twisty, like the spine, spinal rotations as much. It's a little bit more linear, like the lunges or warrior pose is actually like a Swedish Ling pose. And do you know what that comes from? If you were to take a guess being in that pose, thinking of an ancient or not a Western sport.
Fencing.
Yes, exactly.
Good guess. Yeah, I used to teach fencing. I used to think it had a very Aikido-like stance in some ways, but there's the long lunges. And if you look at these kind of old Western books of the sword as well, you'll see some sort of lunging exercises and things, the kind of Western martial arts. Yeah.
And Ling gymnastics, and gymnastics is a weird term that people don't understand too. It's like you think of acrobatics. It's not acrobatics, it's exercises. And most of the Ling gymnastics were standing on place. I mean, they had the ones that are apparatus free was essentially, in a room, in a gymnasium. They could stand in place, fit 40 people in the room, and do full-bodied range of movement exercises that are strengthening and bringing your body into whatever postural strengthening exercises that you go through a whole series, and it's all systematic, like building up in difficulty.
And you'll see the sort of Victorian young ladies in long dresses kind of doing these exercises in old drawings and things, won't you? So you're kind of 19th century. Mm-hmm. Are we looking at here roughly?
Yeah, he funded, early 19th century. He had his institute in Sweden, and it was actually, I think it's fascinating. That's such an understudied area. Like all these movements and everything, he'd have, movements for ill people. So if you're not well enough to do actual exercises.
Again, who are we talking about?
The Ling in Sweden.
Ling. Okay.
The Swedish Ling Institute.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So they'd have a whole variety of exercise. And this is all related to the Cymatics history too. Is that they'd have a thing called medical gymnastics, which is medical exercise. They're essentially movements that you would have practitioners come in and help you do certain movements, almost like a physiotherapist. And all the trainers, they were trained like in physiology, kinesiology. It was a very intensive training, 3 or 4 year program to actually work as a medical gymnastic practitioner. So the institute had a number of different ranges up from those who were ill and could only do medical gymnastics to light gymnastics, which is those who are well enough, kids and boys and women, that they would do light educational gymnastics. And it was put in all the schools, and it went across Britain, all the schools had this training. There's a huge Swedish Ling Gymnastics Institute in London. And these became programs that was before sports were in school, that was the physical education.
Yeah. And this is really looking at health as a narrative, right? So who was the first to bring in the idea that you could actually develop yourself as a person? Like, where did that idea come from? So more than just the physical self.
Oh, that's a big question.
Because you see what I mean? Like we're talking about gymnastics,
okay.
and that can lead to some of the physical somatics tradition.
Yeah.
But where does this
some of it is related to when the Swedish Ling gymnastics in the United States, because in the late 1800s, there was all these educational institutions that there was being taught. So all these body physical exercises, but then it got mixed and merged with what was known as Delsarte gymnastics.
Okay, so this guy's a big figure, and I've been looking up some of his stuff, and there's a few pictures online, not a huge amount. Can you say a little bit more about him?
Okay, so Delsarte was a teacher of oratory. And I was saying before, like oratory practices, they taught breathing exercises, all this vocal work, but also Delsarte was passionate. Well, some of oratory, also they taught expression. So if you're to be a really great public speaker, you have to imagine you'd want to have an interesting character that's up there on the stage or in the pulpit that's dynamic enough to carry a message and has meaning and can, So he was very fascinated in using gesture and the voice and expression of the body, nonverbal expression, to help people communicate in a interesting enough way. He was basically a visionary artist, but he was not an academic whatsoever, and he actually never created a system. He never created a teaching system. He never had students that he taught as like a teaching institution, like Swedish Ling gymnastics was all completely codified and registered. He had 4 years training. Delsarte didn't do that. He was a coach that taught out of his home living room salon. But he had one American student that went over and became fascinated with him. And Delsarte was also he's an extraordinarily passionate Catholic. So he thought everything, mind, body, soul, you had to base everything you did had to be expression of your soul. So that's kind of the part that ended up focusing on what your question was when did it become the person?
Yeah.
A lot of the Delsarte ambitions was to bring out the soul and the being of the person, so that whatever you're doing, you're walking around as your true spirit and identity in a way.
Yeah. So for me, this is the beginning of what I'd call embodied work. It's not simply a method of working on the body through awareness, but it's working with the person itself.
Mm-hmm. So the movement became a movement in the United States. It's a movement known as American Delsartism between 1870s to early 1910. And it was brought to America from this one student that had trained with Delsarte. He was the only singular person to have ever trained with Delsarte. And he came to America, Steele McKay. And he had one student, Genevieve Stebbins, who is the figure that I've now been focusing the massive extent of my research on, because she's a completely unknown person. But what she did was she took Swedish Ling gymnastics because she felt physical culture. You need to have physical. You did need to work with the body in some way to be healthy and be vibrant and to sense your body and movement. And some of the Swedish Ling gymnastics almost had some. It's called aesthetic gymnastics. It was almost like dance-like movement, and it was taken kind of from folkloric dancing, like hips and leaps and tempos, certain tempos, related to folk dance, rhythms and the movement that were related to those rhythms. She that came from Swedish Ling aesthetic gymnastics also, and she brought all these inspirations together to create her own system called Harmonic Gymnastics. And she created a school where she taught harmonic gymnastics, which incorporated all these breathing exercises, embodiment work, work for oratories, but also mainly the whole focus of the work was basically to teach people how to become their own magnetic persona in a way. And go out into the life and be able to do and achieve whatever you wanted, but you're physically enabled and spiritually enabled and very expressive, because she taught expressive techniques also, and certain movement exercises that were called drills, dance, and they were very dance-like.
This is tremendously modern. If we talk about it's almost like personal growth, the full expression of the self, and various practice techniques. And I just want to highlight to listeners, this is way before, say, Moshe Feldenkrais in the 1940s and 50s, or, even before Alexander. This is pre-World War I we're talking, right?
Yes. And actually, a lot of the movement got, I think, disturbed by World War I, as did the Cymatics movement evolution in Germany by World War II. Both of the world wars really kind of destroyed the physical, what was essentially the physical culture movement. And the practitioners got scattered all over the globe in a way. Actually, I think now that because I've done intensive historical studies of physical culture, I believe that actually Feldenkrais and all these other practitioners, all of them in some way, shape, or form are connected to the physical culture movement and exercises and philosophies that grew out of that movement. It's very Western in that way, even though certain people like Feldenkrais got inspired by judo and other Eastern practices.
Yeah.
But to me, I think it's kind of fascinating ultimately because people don't know anything about the history of our Western practices and there's some sort of desperate need for people to feel connected to something that's ancient, or, like when people are doing yoga and they feel like, oh, I'm doing an ancient, wonderful practice. and somehow makes people feel better about themselves. I don't really know why that is. But I think if people understand more about the history of Western practices and even just like how things merge and flow and then all these educational systems come together and people inspire one another. And it doesn't have to be it's either Western or Eastern, but just being aware that there has been a very long educational lineage of all these practices that are still somehow connected to the movements and the forms that we're doing today.
Are there any other names you think from that sort of early period that are kind of underknown that people might be, surprised to hear about in the same way as Genevieve Stebbins is kind of not so well known? I think your paper was the first time I'd heard of her. Is anyone else that you think they should be better known for their contribution?
Well, a lot of her students, she had one German student that came with her from Germany, tried to train with her in New York City, where she had her school at Carnegie Hall, and went back to Germany and created her own school. And her Elsa Gindler was her student. So a lot of my recent publications have focused on just even that educational lineage, because even Heidi Kallmeyer is not a known name, because people have only gone so far back as to say, oh, Elsa Gindler was the first pioneer in the field of semantics.
Yeah, well, everyone comes from somewhere, right? So
I think people get focused on first. Oh, the first pioneer, the first of this, first of that. But everybody comes from something, and there's actually other influences. Generally, you start to look for them, you'll find the influences. The thing with Elsa Gindler is because she thought ended up being esoteric in her approach, that therefore people thought she just kind of invented this way of, or she didn't come from anything because it wasn't essentially a technique by the end. But that was because she was avoiding Nazi arrest, basically. Yeah.
Well, this other one, though, is it Bez Menzen? I can't say his name.
Yeah, Menzendiek. Yeah, and she was also a student of Elsa Gindler, who went to Europe, and she founded schools in Vienna and Austria, and she focused much more on the technical aspect. She almost went backwards before, because Genevieve Stebbins, almost like her work was sort of metaphysical in essence. Like she didn't, Benedict didn't want that, so she almost took out the Delsarte side of it and just focused on the body technique. So she essentially was teaching Swedish Ling gymnastics, but to sort of evolve it in her own way.
And sort of like Alexander technique, Alexander of the Alexander technique, people kind of imagine they came out of nowhere, but I always found it hard to believe that someone would just invent the Alexander technique based out of absolutely nothing.
Yeah. And he actually advertised himself as a Delsarte teacher originally in Australia. But basically what he would have been teaching even then would have been some aspects of Genevieve Stebbins' system. It's just that everybody called it Delsarte. But Delsarte never wrote anything, and he never actually had a system. It was systemized in the United States by Genevieve Stebbins.
Yeah.
But the whole field, everybody is just Delsarte. It was like saying yoga or dance. It was just like, Delsarte is just a common noun. It wasn't actually what he actually created, which confuses the heck out of everybody who's trying to do historical work, because they automatically assume Delsarte made everything because everybody used his name.
Yeah, and it's very difficult, isn't it? Because on the one hand, people are getting influences specifically from teachers, but there's other things that are sort of just in the culture that are ideas around, and then there's the things that people genuinely invent. So it's quite hard to make these kind of lineage tables that say, well, this, not like in sort of Japanese martial arts, where this person taught that person taught that person. Mm-hmm. Not really like that, is it? It's much more of a mess.
Yeah, but there's lots of influences, and people do adapt, and sometimes people do create something out of something, but based upon some sort of, inspiration, creative inspiration that branches off of the other thing they just learned. And they create questions in their own head and explorations that they want to do and follow. And I think Alexander, even though he initially advertised himself as a Delsarte teacher in Australia, he wasn't doing, I think, hands-on techniques there in Australia. He was doing more like the vocal aspect teaching. And because I have wonderful arguments on Facebook with Alexander practitioners and also Delsarte enthusiasts who like just believe Alexander technique is actually a branch of Delsartism, which is not entirely. When Alexander came to London, at that time there was still all these like postural methods and things that were taught and hands-on techniques that were being taught. So I think he just kind of absorbed the general culture of what was going on there and adapted himself with his own background in teaching vocal work. And it gradually grew into a more like hands-on postural system.
Couple more names I think are worth mentioning. So there's Laban, obviously in dance world is really well known, but actually in many other parts of the embodiment world, people have never heard of Rudolf. And then Mabel Todd. So could you say something about those two and their influence?
Sure. Laban, or what it's known as now. I've only had like actually a couple Laban classes, which I don't really like. It's basically like a movement analysis. As a dancer, I'm just like, I don't know, because it's so simple. I mean, it's complex theory, but it's so simple, the actual movements, and I found it so unmotivating. But because basically you're standing in space, and then you learn how the actions of the body, like say you could strike somewhere, or the arm could swoop up someplace else. It's a way of describing how the body could potentially move in space.
Notation system, like music notation, that's part of it.
Yeah. Which was a great part of it, because then there was all these dance pieces that ended up being able to be notated. But basically, it's a movement analysis system. It's a way of looking at how the body is moving in space and being able to note it, and then also maybe analyze it. And for a person who maybe needs help in some way or shape or form, a Laban teacher will then help them figure out how they're moving in space and how they could move better by adjusting their way of moving, as far as I understand. And it's related to Bartenieff. There's an institute in New York City too, the Laban Bartenieff Institute.
Yeah, and some of this, it strikes me that anyone trying to write a history is always going to be biased because, like I know you're coming out of dance, and to me your paper still seems a bit dancey in some ways. Mm-hmm. And there's a strong dance bias, and also culturally, you're meeting certain people in New York or in Canada who are telling you other people are important, whereas if someone in Berlin was writing this, it might look a bit different. It strikes me that anyone trying to write a history of this area is biased both by their geography, but also their own practice background, because it's not like anyone's well versed in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, from even me finding out that Elsa Gindler had originally taught like dance like moves or dance exercises as a dancer, I'm like, see, she didn't teach dance, or there was technique or something like that. But I get some sort of joy of finding out that any of these teachers might have taught some aspect of dance.
Mabel Todd's a name I've heard quite a bit, which don't know much about. Could you say a little bit about them?
She was a teacher in New York City in the early 1900s. And I believe she was teaching out of NYU, or one of her students then taught in NYU. So that's why there's still ideokinesis taught at NYU and Juilliard, because it kind of developed through that university. Mm-hmm. She taught postural, basically postural analysis. She wrote a book, The Thinking Body, which is fantastic, and which I had as a young dancer. And it's a way of looking at anatomy, but it's basically embodied anatomy. Mm-hmm. So she was trying to teach, I don't know if it was just dancers, but just anybody to like think about how your body's moving in different ways by understanding how it is anatomically.
And do you think they have a shelf life to sort of some of these systems? Because I was with some Alexander teachers a few months back, and they're very good at what they did, but it seemed like it solidified in a certain way. It seemed like they weren't really open to new influences. It had become an orthodoxy. I wouldn't say a cult. They weren't that bad, but there was a certain degree of certainty going on after, the practice has been around 100 years. And there's a way in which practices start to seem stale, I find, after a while.
Yeah, well, some people like to stay true to their method, and it's a way of preserving it and giving it or sanctifying it somehow. But then other people I find some practitioners, they'll get bored and all of a sudden they'll start to branch off and they'll start to learn another method and then they'll bring it together. Like my teacher, Martha Eddy in New York City, her dynamic embodiment is what they call an amalgamation technique. She studied with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen doing body-mind centering. She was a master teacher there. And then I think she had a PhD in physiology or movement science, and then, merged. And then she was a Laban Bartenieff person. She was trained with Bartenieff and a dancer. And she just brought all these influences together to create her own method and her own certification program. So I think a lot of different people, like, or in Rolfing too, I think some people decide not to stay true to the method and they went off and branched off and did something else. And it's hard because I think a lot of these, they're so strange in how they develop or even become a technique in the first place. And then then to preserve it and not have other people copy your method, a lot of these programs, they create associations to protect the method and to have a real certification program. So you have students who are actually going out and teaching fully what is the method, and it becomes this. So it takes so long for a method to actually solidify into becoming something that people want to preserve that and have an association that protects these method or advertises them, like the International Somatic Movement Education Therapy Association. It's now a massive umbrella association for all these different somatic methods, even so people could go to one website and look for what are all these programs that are certified if they're interested in it and want to find a program that they might be interested in taking. Or you went to the Strozzi Hetler one? I can't even say that right, but
I've been involved with a bunch of schools over time. So I did some training with Strozzi years back, and a guy called Paul Linden was my main mentor.
And what is he teach? Or what
he has a system called Being in Movement. It's mostly coming out of Aikido, but with an influence of Feldenkrais and a few other things. He's kind of an odd chap that's kind of created his own stuff, but basically was doing a lot of training in the 60s during the kind of Eslan heyday, I would say.
Oh, cool.
And it's interesting because I've come a lot from the martial arts tradition, and dance just wasn't on my radar for the first 10 years of my training. So the first time I picked up a book by some of the names you're talking about, I had no idea who they were. And gradually through martial arts, I started to hear about like Feldenkrais and Alexander technique, because there's a few people that do both. So I was coming at it from a very different perspective. Who do you think that's alive today is a real integrator? Because there's all these different streams, and it strikes me that it's a life's work sometimes to get good at one element. And do you think there are people alive today who, like Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, for example, I think would be a pretty good contender, who are able to really integrate all these streams that have developed over the last 100 or 200 years? Yeah,
I think Bonnie Bainbridge is excellent because all of her, she's had a massive amount of variety of training, her background.
Yeah.
And actually she even trained with one person that was with Elsa, was a student of Elsa Gindler. So she is kind of connected in that way. I wrote an article about it for Currents magazine, which is the journal for body mind centering.
Is anyone
delighted
else? Sorry.
When Bonnie was like, I was delighted when Bonnie sent me an email. She's like, "Oh, I love that the history of like you're connecting these methods." And sometimes when you even train yourself in certain methods, you don't know necessarily the history of who developed and
do they? Yeah. I know it's one thing that Strozzi does is he puts out a sort of lineage chart, and sort of says, look, these are my teachers, this is where this comes from. And a lot of schools, we do a history lesson of embodiment on the embodied facilitator course because the Russians are really, we teach in Russia, and there's a Russian teacher now teaching on the UK program, and they're very big on philosophy and models and where things come from. They like to be rigorous. They're sort of Germanic in that way. And the Russians were saying, well, where does this come from? I was saying, oh, kind of here, kind of there. I don't really know, I know my teachers, but I wouldn't necessarily know their teachers, and definitely not their teachers' teachers. So for me, it's been a bit of a journey to start like exploring this and looking into this and getting rid of some of the myths about yoga or about who trained who,
And for your embodiment work, where does that historically come from, do you find? Or
well, I use that term as the coverall term for all of these fields. So I'm using that much as you would use the word somatic, just because I find the word somatics a bit foreign to people. So there's, different lineages within that. I identify sort of 6 main lineages. And of those 6, we have trainers who are trained in 2 of the 6 each. So I've got a kind of background in martial arts and yoga, though even that is, you can't be complete in those areas. And then there's a trainer who has a background in theatre, which I think is missing from some of yours, actually. And also a background in dance. And then another practitioner has a background in body work and conscious dance, so another kind of area. So what I've found is for someone to study even 2 of these areas makes them a hell of a professional, and to study all 6 of them is almost impossible in a lifetime. Though there are people who sort of have 4 or 5 of the pieces of the puzzle, maybe like Strozzi or Bainbridge Cohen, like people who are really spent an entire lifetime really studying. And certainly a life goal for me would be to develop just even a degree of competence in those 6 areas. Like I'm starting to do some body work training over the next few years, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, you seem to be doing very well with your embodied work as a facilitator and trainer.
It's getting out there. I mean, I think you can be useful to people without knowing the history, and you can be useful to people with even just a piece of the puzzle, as it were. And sometimes they end up in similar places, I find, as well, because there's a universal body mind, and if people study it from a dance point of view, or a theatre point of view, or a bodywork point of view, they're going to come up with some very similar things.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to say on the sort of history of this field? Because I feel I'm going to point people to this paper. I'm going to read it again myself and share it to the Embodiment Conference group as well. Anything else you want to say to wrap that up?
Well, I guess funny enough, like just it's important to know history, but at the same time for people training and stuff like that, it's not really the first thing that necessarily people care about. And it's not really, I don't really, at the same time, I care about it so much because I've just become a nerd about it. I just got fascinated with these certain questions, and I've been pursuing that history. And whoever might want to read my work or care about it, that's that would be great. I'm just a nerd about it, and it's become my passion and what I'm interested in doing. And I think I'm hoping that even just my thesis, it can just help people get just a little bit more background information related to somatics in general, and in so doing, maybe help have people be a little bit more interested in trying out different somatic methods.
Yeah. Okay, Kelly. Well, we're on time. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm definitely going to share this share this paper with people. If people go to the Embodiment Podcast website, they'll be able to find it. The URL is a bit complicated otherwise.
Subscribe to get more, and you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings, so really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon, give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now, and what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. Maud and I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.